how that works. I come to meet you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started now. First of all, does everyone have one of these? If you do not have one of these, let me know. Okay, good to go. For those people who are watching on YouTube, this is just the printout of First Maccabees Chapter 1. So if you're following along online, just Google it, you'll find it. For those of you who are sitting in here, you get to hear more of me. Yay! I know you're excited. I did look this morning. There were 12 views on YouTube, which I can honestly say is the most I've ever gotten from a video on YouTube. So appreciation to all of those people who were interested enough to check it out. There's no PowerPoint tonight. That's why we have the handout, but as things get more complicated and we start talking about like these genealogies and who's the son of who and what their stories are, then we'll put it up there and it'll be useful, I think, to help us along. Just to recap what we talked about last week, we kind of mentioned what is the First Maccabees. It's an apocryphal book. We talked about why the Apocrypha isn't in our Bible. And we also talked about why the apocryphal books are important, right? Because they provide the Jewish theological development of the intertestamental period, about, there's no prophets. We talked about how that kind of affected how the Jews thought about things and how they wrote things down, and also the political stage that is going to set the agenda for a lot of the people and the characters in Jesus' life. So we're going to talk about the kingdoms, or we did talk about the kingdoms since Babylonian captivity, and this crisis period that we're going to talk about today. So we didn't actually get into the text last week, but we did kind of have an overview of the events that we're going to discuss. So about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, I did mention that they're kind of a little less controversial than the other apocryphal books just because they're like histories. Kind of like Samuel or Kings or Chronicles. It's just an author writing down the events that he sees as they happen. It is not chronological, so it's not like 1st Maccabees, you read to the end of 1st Maccabees, and then you pick up in 2nd Maccabees, and then you read to the end of 2nd Maccabees. That's not how the books are ordered. So 1st Maccabees is more of a broader narrative of what happens. It encompasses more time, and it talks about 3 generations of this family, the Maccabean family, right? So the first generation is a guy named Mattathias. He's not around for very long in 1st Maccabees, but he's important. He has 3 sons. This constitutes the 2nd generation of the Maccabees. So the sons are Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. All right, you don't need to know these. I'm just letting you know for the future so that it's not going to be completely, deer in the headlights look whenever we start talking about these characters. And then the 3rd generation is a guy named John Hyrcanus. Okay, so this family is very well revered in the books. They are going to be the ones that bring Israel's salvation from being completely, assimilated into the Greek culture. 2nd Maccabees, however, is more specific. It's mostly about Judas, and it's about the Jewish priesthood. And it talks about how God uses Judas to defend the temple. The temple is his chief concern in 2nd Maccabees, and it's a lot more, it's more dramatic, you might say. It's a lot less, stick to the facts, here's the account, here's the dates, here's who did what. It's going to be much more, these are the awful things that the Greeks did. And so there's a lot of stories about martyrs and more kind of dialogue and more emotional kind of moments in Second Maccabees. So what we will do is we will mostly just follow First Maccabees, and that's why what's printed out tonight in your handout is just First Maccabees Chapter 1, and then we'll supplement the main story points in First Maccabees with some of the contextual and the more in-depth stories that the Second Maccabees gives us. Okay, so if you want to learn more about it, by all means, go read it. It's pretty easy to find, but that's kind of the way that the course is going to go. A brief note. You'll see on your handout that this says First Maccabees Chapter 1, New American Bible Revised Edition, NABRE. That is a translation. So just like the other texts that we have, the Apocrypha has different translations. So if you happen to be reading along with a text that you have that has the Apocrypha, I know somebody was saying that they have, so Lee has one, and somebody else was saying that that's like their standard go-to. I think it was Dennis, says that he brings a Greek Orthodox Bible, and that is, right. Yeah, so if you're reading along in that and it says something slightly different than what's in the handout, that's why. So it might have different wording. So who's familiar with the NABRE? Is that a translation that you all have heard of, that you're familiar with, kind of? It's something that it's not really very mainstream for us because it's published by the Catholic press. And I don't want to say that we discount things that the Catholics publish, but we tend to look on them a little less favorably, probably. So why would I choose this translation to hand out, the NABRE, rather than something that's a little bit more, I don't even want to say Protestant, but more mainline, something that's a little easier to find, like the New Revised Standard Edition or New Revised Standard Version? And the reason is simply because the Catholics did a good job translating it. It's pretty much easier to read. It's got some really useful footnotes that I just went ahead and printed off. You're welcome to look at those footnotes. We'll probably reiterate some of them as we go, but I find that they're quite useful, so feel free to peruse them at your leisure. Okay. With all of that out of the way, we're going to dive into the text. So, who here could read 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, just that first section from Alexander to Antiochus? Volunteers. Oh, y'all didn't know I was going to call you out in class. Go ahead, Brother Ralph.
After Alexander the Macedonian, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, he became king in his place, having first ruled in Greece. He fought many battles, captured fortresses, and put the kings of the earth to death. He advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plunder from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. He collected a very strong army and won dominion over provinces, nations, and rulers, and they paid him tribute. But after all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. So he summoned his noblest officers who had been brought up with him from his youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. Alexander had reigned 12 years when he died. So his officers took over his kingdom, each in his own territory. And after his death, they all put on diadems. And so did their sons after them for many years, multiplying evils on the earth. There sprang from these a sinful offshoot, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, once a hostage at Rome. He became king in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks.
Thanks, Ralph. So, like I said, this text is actually pretty straightforward. And actually, all of chapter 1, I meant to mention this earlier, is really just one big, huge scene setter for the Maccabean revolt. So we're not actually going to see any of those Mattathias or the Maccabean families tonight. This is kind of the intro, right? This is even the author of histories have to kind of set the stage, and so that's what we're doing here. And so the stage is set, first of all the way back to Alexander the Great. So it calls him he came from the land of Kittim. That doesn't really mean anything to us. So Kittim is actually the capital of Cyprus, and it kind of became to be known as anybody from Cyprus, any Cypriot, and then it came to be more general of any Greek, and then it became even more general than that of any Greek or Roman. So, I mean, it really just means kind of like somebody from the main culture. And so even though we know that he's from Macedonia, and it even says he's the Macedonian, but the land of Kittim, that's why the confusion there. Kittim doesn't necessarily mean from the specific town. And Alexander the Great had a remarkable conquest. We look back at this and say, wow, he had an enormous kingdom. And for the time, it was even more remarkable. I mean, he was like the original blitzkrieg kind of warfare. I mean, he just bulldozed people. The Persians had been in power for a long time, and they thought they were pretty something because they kicked out the Babylonians, and they were something, and it didn't matter. They just got handed to them that, they just didn't stand a chance against him. I mean, that war took like 3 years or something, and his kingdom spread from Greece through Turkey, all the way to the outskirts of India, all the way south into Egypt. He just owned everything. And then he died. He got sick. He knew he was going to die. And this whole language about his generals gathering them and figuring out how that was going to all go down didn't happen exactly the way that that the text would lead you to believe, but that's probably how the author was led to believe that it went down as well, because it was very much in the general's interest that people saw them as being legitimate rulers of their regions. So there was a lot of infighting, and when I say a lot, I mean like 20 years worth of infighting over who was going to take which region. And even after the dust finally settles, they're still fighting each other. They kind of have shaky boundaries, but they're not happy with their boundaries. They want to expand, and so there's fighting amongst the I don't want to say descendants, but the people who received the kingdom from Alexander. And of course, the main thing about this huge empire that Alexander built is that it influenced all of the countries that it dominated, right? So it influenced them with the way that they do their military strategy. It influences their economics. It influences their politics. It influences their language, which is significant, right? Because we all know how, we talked last week about the Septuagint and how Greek kind of became the universal language. But the most relevant is that it really influenced their culture and their religions as well. So I think that's, okay. We're going to pause here for a minute more and talk about the Antiochus Epiphanes. We're going to see a lot of this guy, and so I think it's important for us to kind of get the backstory on him before we keep going farther. Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, he is Epiphanes, by the way, means God manifest. So that kind of tells you what this guy thought about himself. He is a little full of himself. So he was actually a hostage in Rome. We'll get into that. But his father is Antiochus III. Antiochus III is also known as Antiochus the Great. And, I talked about how Syria and then kind of the north of Judah had the Seleucid Empire. So he was granted the Seleucid Empire, but because of the ongoing war with the Romans, so the Greeks are at war with the Romans at this point, and so he spends a lot of his time overseas. He's not governing a whole lot in the area, but he's very well known. He was advised by Hannibal after Hannibal was exiled. He eventually loses to the Romans, right? He's in a couple of battles, and Thermopylae and Magnesia. And for anybody who's really a history nut, you will learn that Greece is ultimately defeated by Rome, and they sign what's called the Treaty of Apamaya. The Treaty of Apamaya, first of all, it caps Greece's military forces. It says you're only allowed to have so many soldiers and warships and elephants and this kind of thing. The other thing that it did was to make sure that they held to their end of the bargain is it said, all right, all of your great lords and generals and nobles, your kids are going to come live in Rome, and we're going to watch them. So if you step out of line, that is the end of your line, right? So this is why Antiochus IV is exiled to Rome, and that's why it mentions that in the text. Once a hostage in Rome is because he was being held by the Romans to make sure that Antiochus didn't do anything that would violate the treaty. Antiochus III died. And so his successor was a guy named Seleucus IV, Philopater. Seleucus, his oldest son, is supposed to go replace Antiochus IV in Rome, but it takes a long time for that to happen. First of all, his son is like super young. Like I want to say he's like 2 or 3 whenever Seleucus takes takes power. So it takes a while for him to kind of be up to the journey for going to Rome, and then it's a long journey, right? It takes a long time to get from Syria to Rome, and then for Antiochus IV to get back from Rome to Syria. So it's like 8 years. Seleucus gets to reign for like 8 years before Antiochus IV makes it back. Seleucus, he's still in the same position that Antiochus III was in. He still has to pay the Romans for the war, according to the treaty. And so because he has to pay the Romans, like they said, hey, we won all of the expenses that we had to have to pay our soldiers and build our ships and everything, you guys get to pay for that. Fork it over. That was part of the treaty. So now they're on the hook. They've got a lot of debt. And so one of the easy ways to get money is to go pillage the temple, right? So that's what Antiochus III had done this before, and Seleucus IV says, you know what, I'm going to do that as well. And he sends a guy named Heliodrus, who's his minister. And I want to read a super interesting kind of section from 2 Maccabees here. You know, I said that we were going to supplement this occasionally with 2 Maccabees. So this is one of those times that I want to do that. This is just a quick story about what happens to Heliodrus whenever he comes to pillage the temple. When he arrived at the treasury with his bodyguards, then and there the sovereign of the spirits and all authority caused so great a I'm going to read this from the NABRE. Sorry. That's what I was talking about. It's a little easier to read from the other one. Just as Heliodrus was arriving at the treasury with his bodyguards, the Lord of Spirits and all authority produced an apparition so great that those who had been bold enough to accompany Heliodrus were panic-stricken at God's power and fainted away in terror. There appeared to him a richly caparisoned horse mounted by a fearsome rider, and charging furiously, the horse attacked Heliodrus with its front hooves. The rider was seen wearing golden armor. Then 2 other young men, remarkably strong, strikingly handsome, and splendidly attired, appeared before him. Standing on each side of him, they flogged him unceasingly, inflicting innumerable blows. Suddenly he fell to the ground, enveloped in great darkness. His men picked him up and laid him on a stretcher. They carried away helpless the man who, a moment before, had entered that treasury under arms with a great retinue and his whole bodyguard. And they clearly recognized the sovereign power of God. And as Heliodrus lay speechless because of God's action and deprived of any hope of recovery, the people praised the Lord, who had marvelously glorified his own place. And the temple, charged so shortly before with fear and commotion, was filled with joy and gladness now that the mighty Lord had appeared. And basically, Onias, who is the high priest, he gives a sacrifice on behalf of Heliodrus and says, spare his life. And so the men who just completely dismantled him come back and say, you need to thank that guy, otherwise you'd be dead. And Heliodrus goes back to his boss, Seleucid IV, and says, Seleucid's like, what happened? You were supposed to pillage the temple. You had a whole bodyguard and an armory of people, and you come back and you don't have anything. What do you have to say? And Heliodrus says, if you have an enemy or someone who's plotting against you, make him go. And he'll take a flogging, and he is better him than me. I'm not going back. So super interesting. So it doesn't turn out for Seleucid IV. Anyway, Antiochus IV gets back. Like I said, Seleucus IV is on the throne for 8 years, and then Antiochus IV gets back, and he basically assassinates Seleucus and seizes the throne. So Seleucus IV has a son now who is like 10 years old, who is in Rome, but it doesn't matter because Antiochus has recovered the throne. He has an infant son. Even though his eldest is in Rome, he also has an infant son, Antiochus IV. Antiochus Epiphanes proclaims himself co-regent. And if any of you all are familiar with how kings and monarchies and these things happen, co-regent is code for this boy is going to die soon. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. This boy dies soon, and Antiochus IV becomes the sole heir. And he is the evil offshoot. This whole paragraph is really to tell you that Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be the villain here for a little bit. Okay, I talked for long enough. Somebody read 11 through 15. Okay, so this is about the lawless Jews. You'll notice that the lawless Jews are not named. Second Maccabees has no problem naming these people. First Maccabees kind of tends to take the approach that I don't want to even give these guys the credit of having a name. I hope that they are just blotted out from history and nobody even remembers who they are. Second Maccabees has no problem just vilifying these people. You just don't give them any notoriety. So this whole business about there being people who go to the Gentiles and say, we want the Gentiles we want to invite them in. Ever since we became separate and tried to enforce our separation laws and become holy people the way God wanted us to, bad things happen to us. Let's stop doing that. And so the first two chapters, or not first two, there are two chapters of Second Maccabees that kind of address this. So the high priest was Onias. That was the one that we talked about who sacrificed on behalf of Heliodrus. He gets betrayed. Eventually he gets murdered. His brother Jason and another guy named Menelaus fight over the high priesthood. That's the bottom line. I don't think it's necessary to go into all of that. It's not too important for the overall story, but Jason and Menelaus are the two who are fighting for the high priesthood. And it gets really political. It gets really nasty. They are clearly not trying to do things in a godly way. But this gymnasium business, this whole inviting the Gentiles in and becoming Gentile, is a really, really big deal. So a gymnasium is a big deal in and of itself. It's basically like the philosophical and cultural hub of the Greeks, and there's going to be a youth center there, and you're basically indoctrinating all of the people, all of the kids, and you're trying to make them as Greek as possible. So let me read this real quick. This one's faster than the other one. Seleucus died, and when Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, succeeded him on the throne, Anias' brother Jason obtained the high priesthood by corrupt means. In an interview, he promised the king 360 talents of silver, as well as 80 talents from another source of income. Besides this, he would undertake to pay 150 more if he was given authority to establish a gymnasium and a youth center for it, and to enroll Jerusalemites as citizens of Antioch. When Jason received the king's approval and came into office, he immediately initiated his compatriots into the Greek way of life. Pause. This is the Jewish high priest going to the Greek king saying, I want to be more Greek and I want to make other people more Greek, and I'll give you more money if you will let us be more Greek. This is exact opposite of what God wants for his people and what his high priest should be doing, right? Continuing. With perverse delight, he established a gymnasium at the very foot of the citadel, where he induced the noblest men to wear the Greek hat. The craze for Hellenism and the adoption of foreign custom reached such a pitch that through the outrageous wickedness of Jason, the renegade and would-be high priest, the priests no longer cared about their service of the altar. Disdaining the temple and neglecting their sacrifices, they hastened at the signal for the games to take part in the unlawful exercises at the arena. What their ancestors had regarded as honors, they despised. What the Greeks esteemed as glory, they prized highly. And for this reason, they found themselves in serious trouble. So, I mean, this is about as bad as it gets, right? Whenever your leaders are saying we need to be less like ourselves and more like them, what are the Jews supposed to do at this point, right? Like, what are their options? Even this whole, like, hiding your circumcision thing, there's evidence that people tried to reverse their circumcision. It's a procedure that they had, right? It's called an epispasm. It's a real thing. Like in ancient days, they would try to do this because, of course, the games held at the gymnasium were done in the nude. So it was hard to, you had to hide yourself.
This group of Jews, is that the Hellenists that was mentioned, is that the starting of the Hellenists that's mentioned in the New Testament?
The Hellenistic Jews?
Yeah.
Likely. I'd have to do a little bit more research on the Hellenistic Jews. But I think that's an Acts, right?
Yeah, I can't remember where. I just remember it being mentioned.
I'll come back to you next week.
But it would be the seeds of it, at least. I would think.
At the very least. At the very least. So anyway, bad things are happening. So let's keep reading the next section. Actually, the next two sections. We have the Antiochus in Egypt and then the robbery of the temple, if somebody could read those.
When his kingdom seemed secure, Antiochus undertook to become king of the land of Egypt and to rule over both kingdoms. He invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots, elephants, and cavalry, and with a large fleet to make war on Ptolemy, king of Egypt. Ptolemy was frightened at his presence and fled, and many were wounded and fell dead. The fortified cities in the land of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus plundered the land of Egypt. You want the next section also?
Yes, please.
After Antiochus had defeated Egypt in the 143rd year, he returned and went up against Israel and against Jerusalem with a strong force. He insolently entered the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for light with all its utensils, the offering table, the cups and bowls, the golden censers, and the curtain. The cornices and the golden ornament on the facade of the temple, he stripped it all off. And he took away the silver and gold and the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all this, he went back to his clothed with shame.
Yeah, that's the end of that section. So what happened was Antiochus, I said that there was still a lot of fighting over boundaries. So Antiochus is in Syria in the north, and then Ptolemy is in Egypt in the south. And Judah kind of gets caught in the crossfire a bunch of times. So in this particular instance, he wants to raid and take over the Egyptians. He has a very, very successful campaign, but that does not mean that he is able to capture Alexandria. He's not able to kill Ptolemy. But on his way back, he hears that Judea is in a revolt. And this is a result of the fighting between Jason and Menelaus. Like, they are actually literally taking up arms and fighting with one another. One of them has locked themselves in a fortress, and the other sieging. Like, it's bad. And he hears about this, and he just assumes that the whole region is in a revolt. So he comes up there, and there's one way that the Greeks are going to deal with an uprising, and that's just to squash everybody. And so he does. He comes through the city, and he just sacks the whole thing. There are people who are just killed by the thousands, and thousands more are carried off into slavery. And there's a few reasons for this. One, for the revolt. Two, he probably needs money, having just been on this raid. He's got to pay his soldiers, same as we had been talking about before. So it's an easy kind of way to get cash. And remember, the temple is, there's money changers at the temple because it also kind of serves as a bank. So there's also there's a lot of, aside from all of the holy elements that are in the temple itself, there's also a lot of money to be had just as part of that facet of what the temple does and service that it provides to some of the people. And also, remember Menelaus and then Jason that I said were fighting against each other. Menelaus himself is, Jason just gets ousted, and Menelaus welcomes this person into Judea with open arms, saying, I want to be the new high priest. Please appoint me. Come on into the temple. I'll give you a guided tour, and you can take anything you want. And so, again, you have your leadership doing just the exact opposite of what you want to see, and how he should be leading God's people, God's chosen nation. So, we can read the next section. Okay, so the Mysians are mercenaries, right? So they're still being employed by Antiochus. They come in and they despoil the whole city rather than just the temple. And I mean, this is sad things to hear about. They're taking captive women and children, and they're destroying the people's way of life in the city of David. The main takeaway from this section, though, is the citadel. They built this fortress right in Jerusalem, and that is going to be a thorn in their side for a long time to come. Even after the Maccabees raise up and try to kick the people out, or kick out the Greeks, they'll still have a trouble getting rid of this citadel. Like 25 years into their revolt, the citadel will eventually fall, but it's going to be a pain. Okay, I'll just read this last section because there's the first bell. This last section is straightforward, but rather bleak. So, sorry ahead of time. The king wrote to his whole kingdom that they should all be one people and abandon their particular customs. And all the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king, and many Israelites delighted in his religion, and they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. The king sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land, to prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all its ordinances. Whoever refused to act according to the command of the king was to be put to death. In words such as these, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people, and he ordered the cities of Judah to offer sacrifices, each city in turn. Many of the people, those who abandoned the law, joined them and committed evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding, wherever places of refuge could be found. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, the king erected the desolating abomination upon the altar of burnt offerings, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built pagan altars. They also burned incense at the doors of houses and in the streets. Any scrolls of the law that they found were tore up and burned. Whoever was found with a scroll of the covenant and whoever observed the law was condemned to death by royal decree. So they used their power against Israel, against those who were caught each month in the cities. On the 25th day of each month, they sacrificed on the pagan altar that was over the altar of burnt offerings. In keeping with the decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, and they hung their babies from the necks, and their families also, and those who had circumcised them were killed. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. They preferred to die rather than be defiled with food or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die, and great wrath came upon Israel. So like I said, rather bleak. And, it says the king said this for his whole kingdom, but really we only have a record of this happening in Judah. So 2 Maccabees, like I said, is a bit more emotional, is a bit more narrative. It devotes 2 full chapters to just stories of martyrs. You get like 3 or 4 stories of just people who are up, trying to stand up for the law and do what God tells them to do, and they all die. And it is just a terrible time. And so this is kind of, the Jews are in a bad way. This is the scene that has been set for us that is makes it all the more powerful whenever the revolt comes up, right? The culture is literally getting beat out of them. And so next week, the revolt begins. So hope you'll join us then. I look forward to it.